Hi, everyone. Joining us today is a very special author. Well, in fact, this is his return. He's the first author to return on the Fantasy Book Critic video podcast series. So big kudos to him for bearing me, for a second time. He is, in my opinion, one of the best epic fantasy authors in the indie scene. And should he ever choose to get traditionally published, he would still count as that on the traditionally published side as well. He has previously been a SPFPO finalist, and his most recent book, Umbral Storm, is in the running for this year's SPFPO as well. So welcome, Alec Hutson. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. How are you doing today, sir?
Thank you very much. I'm doing great. It's a great honor to be here as always. Thank you so much, Mihir.
Well, there is no honor, sir. There's just, you give us your time. So that is always, that is always exciting for me to kind of talk to you and to the other authors as well. But today, especially, I wanted to talk to you about like your most recent release, the Book of Zog. Firstly, how's it going for you? Like, I know you had first released it on Royal Roads in like, in chapter installments. And now that the book is out, I think a little over a month or so. How has that book release been for you? You kind of did a stealth release, so as to speak.
Yeah, it was never meant as a major release. I just, after I finished my Umbral Storm and published it in May, I just needed to take a little break from that world for a while. And I was casting about I had an idea about sort of a more cozy-ish fantasy about a Lovecraftian horror, which is perhaps not the easiest sell to begin with. And I started writing it, and it got to 20,000 words, and then it continued to grow and eventually became something more like a book. I think it's like 65,000. In terms of sales, it's been very muted compared to maybe some of my other releases, but I never really expected it to set the world on fire. It was just a fun side project. And I was happy how it turned out. I mean, I'm proud of it. So maybe it's funny. It didn't sell very well when I first published it. As you said, it was a bit of a stealth release, but then it just sort of has maintained. So it's like I'm getting the same sales and reads now that I was almost at the release. Which maybe means that it's getting some staying power at least, and people will come to discover it in time. But we'll see. With writing, it's always you put something out in the world, and sometimes it's welcomed rapturously, and sometimes it's people dismiss it. So
well, it's definitely not been dismissed because I remember when at the weekend you release it, I found out about it. It just popped up on my Kindle because it's like, hey, this might be a book you might be interested in. And I read it in a single afternoon. It like you mentioned, it's a short book, but it's so wonderfully written that I could not stop reading it. I was literally hoping to read it for an hour and then maybe see, I'll come back to it later. Two and a half hours later, I was done with it. And I was like, wow, this was a really quick read and really fun read as well. Like you mentioned, the Lovecraftian angle, there's a cozy fantasy angle to that. And I want to get into that. But before that, I do want to ask you, you mentioned previously, that you were wanting to test out Royal Road, just for an experimental purposes. And this book was, as you mentioned, was released on Royal Road first. How did that experiment go for you? Were you satisfied a little bit more from it than as compared to Kindle Vella?
Yes, I actually enjoyed my time on Royal Road quite a bit. I've tried different story serialization sites. Actually, The Crimson Queen I first serialized on Wattpad 7 years ago, whenever the years running up to actually publishing the book. I wrote The Umbral Storm on Kindle Vella, and I decided that I'd try these other ones. I should try Royal Road because it's sort of the most famous one for it has a lot of fantasy fans on it already, so it seemed like there was a bit of a built-in audience. And actually my experience went really well. They really liked the story. It was towards the top of the news stories for the month and a half that I had it on there. And I got a lot of comments. There were I think at some point there was like 1,000 people reading each installment that came out at least. So actually, the story was far more successful on Royal Road than it was on officially published on Kindle. But the interface is great on Royal Road. There's a lot of passionate readers. I think they tend to be pretty young, at least just from the way that they interacted. But it's fun to see that kind of passion in sort of the next generation of fantasy fans. There's certain kind of books that do really, really well on Royal Road. Things lit RPG and progression, sort of like the up and coming fantasy genres. And my book wasn't quite that. but it still managed to get a bit of, there was still some support there for it. So I would recommend Royal Road to fantasy authors who want to try out a project and see how it's received. It's unlike some of the other serialization sites, you don't get paid for it, but exposure is, you know, what authors are looking for. So I think there are a lot of benefits to posting there. So yeah, it was a good experience. And honestly, I was impressed, like just browsing around the site and reading some of the stories. There's some really high quality stuff on there that hasn't made its way onto the Kindle. I was blown away. I think the author's name was Raven's Dagger is what they went by, but they had some terrific stories on there. And I was just thinking that this is like the incubator for the next generation of fantasy talent. Yeah. And
yes,
pretty cool.
It is, and like you mentioned, like, you know, there's a younger skew to the population who reads over there, and also, like, you know, the lit RPG and progression crowds kind of, like, you know, seem to merge over there. So I'm glad to hear that was a successful experiment, especially for such a different book as well. So hopefully, you know, that'll lead to more readers now experiencing the rest of your book. So fingers crossed for that. Coming back to the Book of Zog, because you mentioned something like it's a Lovecraftian book, or, you know, with Lovecraftian eldritch horror, and it's a cozy fantasy. Now, that is one of the most unique oxymorons I've ever come across, not just in reading, but just hearing about it. I know people, like, especially authors, don't like to talk about their inspirations, but I'm hoping maybe you can come, you know, we can make an exception over here as to where that idea came from, or or it just popped up in your head one day.
I'm trying to remember. I remember I wanted to do something that was a combination of two completely disparate genres, something that didn't seem to go together normally, you know, and then just to see what I could make of it. And if it was I could have written 2,000 words and decided it was a failed experiment, but I liked what I had when I started and I just kept going. In terms of where the inspiration came from, I think I might have been browsing like a Reddit fantasy thread, and someone mentioned like, I want a book from the perspective of an eldritch horror or something like that, maybe. And then that sort of percolated in my head, and I've been reading a lot of cozy fantasies. I think I finished Legends and Lattes recently, you know, and I was thinking like, oh, what a great story that was. And I don't know if I actually pulled off the cozy aspect to it, but there are again, I think the cozy genre is one that's kind of subjective based on the reader, you know, because you're trying to summon a particular emotion in the reader, and it's going to work in some cases and some it's not. It's not as cut and dry as like epic fantasy.
Yep.
But I was going for, you know, some positive vibes in the book, and kind of the found family is a theme oftentimes when it comes to cozy fantasies. And so even though it may not fit the genre perfectly, I think it was a decent attempt, given the fact that I was trying to do it from the perspective of a, you know, cosmic horror.
Yes, and talking about Zogrusz, is that how you pronounce him, Zogrusz?
Yeah, his full name, yeah.
Yes, his full name.
That's Zogrusz. What I would pronounce it as, yeah. I actually, to find that, when I started writing the book, I was like, what am I going to call this guy? And then I just would, and in fact, you can find anything online. Online, there was a Lovecraftian name generator. So I just clicked, and then I saw a list of names, and I was like, that's the guy. That's the one right there. So that's how I came up with that name. They didn't provide a pronunciation guide, though, with the name generator, so.
Well, I'm just pronouncing all the syllables, so it to my mind, it seemed like Zogrusz is how you would pronounce it, but I'm glad you confirmed that. You have written him as a very fascinating character, even though we see his birth, like literally the start of the book. This is not a spoiler. He comes into existence, and then throughout the story we see his evolution, so as to speak. You know, from that eldritch horror being born from in the depths of the universe to where he reaches to a planet and everything like that. And all through the story, you have managed to encapsulate him in a very, I don't want to say humane way, but in a very interesting way. When you were writing this, because I know you just mentioned that when you started out, it was just a fun experiment. But then, when was it that during that experiment that you figured like, oh no, maybe I can figure this out, I can write it? And how did you write this character so well?
Oh, I don't know if I wrote him well, but thank you. I don't know. I think I started to enjoy the character when he was, right in the beginning, when he was sort of exploring the universe, and his interactions with it and what he desired as a newly birthed entity that wasn't influenced necessarily by his progenitors.
Mm-hmm.
And I liked writing someone who was approaching the universe in a wide-eyed way and experiencing things and trying to figure out why they were there, what was their purpose. Yeah, so I don't know. I went with that angle with his character. I think that's a fun character to write, you know.
It was certainly fun to read. Like I could not, like, each chapter I kept on, like, we got to see his evolution, and we got to see as he interacted with other beings, like, how that experience kept on changing him for the better, so as to speak. I really love that. Did you happen to have you previously read any of Lovecraft's work? Like, did you do any research for the story, or it was just?
I didn't reread anything specifically for this story, but I read a ton of Lovecraft in my time. So yeah, I'm familiar with the subgenre of cosmic horror. I wasn't really trying to write a Lovecraftian story, but just with a Lovecraftian mythos as a backdrop. But yeah, I wasn't going for the same existential dread. That was the opposite of cozy, which is sort of what appealed to me in the first place, actually.
And that makes sense. And of course, there's an aspect to it, like, in the story, which I don't want to spoil, so I'll leave it at, because there's that aspect to, the Lovecraftian horror, which we do get to see towards somewhere in the book, but that's something that's a topic for a spoiler-filled talk. There's also a cat in the story, and do you pronounce his name as Ross or Raz?
That's how I would pronounce it. Yeah,
Ross. Okay, sorry. I keep on asking you. I apologize for this, but I loved Ross's character. How did Ross and his or their assimilation in the story, how did that happen? Was it planned from the first?
Yes, I was always going to have him interact with sort of the world spirit of the world that he eventually went to. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess the character, I had a pretty strong sense of what I wanted Ross to be, sort of wise, but also he would have a sense of humor as well, and caring, empathetic. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's where I was going with that.
I have to ask this. You mentioned empathetic. Then why a cat?
Oh, good point. Actually, he was a rabbit the first time that when I initially was outlining the first beginning of the story, it was going to be a rabbit. And then I happen to be a massive cat fan. Mm-hmm. I love cats, and decided, well, I've never had a cat character, so I'll go in that direction.
It works because he's smart, but he's also he approaches Zogrusz with some, I don't want to say trepidation, but with some measure, that he's not really sure of what to expect. He kind of understands what Zogrusz is or what his kind is, but therefore he still doesn't judge him beforehand like that. So in that manner, it was really fascinating to see his cat-like instincts, in approaching Zogrusz, and then of course their interactions later on as well. I happened to catch this very small Easter egg you had put in about this entity called the Weaver in the Darkness. Having read The Shadows of the Dust last year, I recall that there was a mention of this Weaver in the Darkness as well. This is perhaps the only, I think, space horror aspect in this entire story, so as to speak. Does this mean there's something more, or is it just it's just a fun Easter egg for
No,
people?
You're a very careful reader to catch up on it, because it's a very tiny thing in both books. But both, I never intended them to be the same universe. I think there are some fundamental rules in both universes that mean they're separate. But I did put that in there just for someone like you who may have read my other stuff would get a kick out of it. Both of them are sort of what I would consider space fantasies, which is a genre that I really enjoy, even though it seems like readers are the larger pool of readers aren't as big fans of. But I just wanted to have some sort of thread connecting these two space fantasy stories that I'd written. So yeah, that's where that came from.
That was fun. That was fun to read, because I was like, for a second I was excited, and I was like, wait, does this mean that there's connected? Does this mean that Karen will show up and the turtle and everything? So I was kind of excited to see that. But of course, in the way the story ends, there's also a potential sequel. But I want to get back to this, surprising thing that you mentioned, that you love space fantasy. What is it about space fantasy that you love it, and how would you even define the genre, so as to speak, or subgenre?
So when I was a kid, I loved comic books, particularly Marvel comic books. And I would say that the aspect of them that most intrigued me as a kid and got my imagination churning the fastest was when they left Earth and went into outer space and they encountered beings like the Celestials and the Watcher. And, you know, I remember the old comic panels that like Jack Kirby used to make, and there's so much color in space. You know, it just seems like there's so much magic and mystery out there. And so I guess that's what intrigued me about the idea of space fantasy. The universe is such a vast place. Who knows what could be out there? And it relates back to like H.P. Lovecraft too. Like, you know, the idea of strange beings being out there among the stars. It just gives me that little pop of wonder that I look for in fantasy. So that's why I wanted to try and write some stuff with, you know, kind of twining fantasy and outer space instead of science fiction and outer space, which you can also do the same thing with. Yeah.
I mean, and there's threads of science fiction, or science fictional aspects in both Shadows of the Dust and, you know, this book as well. Just this one less so, more so in the Shadows of the Dust. So that, you know, you released 2 books in 2 years. Does that mean there's a trilogy in the making with these standalone, you know, space fantasy
I was
stories?
actually thinking about that. If I write another space fantasy, I could bundle together as a collection. Maybe I could have Believer in Darkness being the common thread binding them all together. Maybe that's the main character in the 3rd book. Who knows? But I would like to write more. I do have a ton of stuff on my plate right now, but quite possibly when I finish my next book, I'll have some idea that I just can't not put aside and start writing, and something like the Book of Zog will manifest itself. It's possible.
Fingers crossed, because I love what you're doing with this. You know, last year with the Shadows of the Dust and this with the Book of Zog as well. It was just, it's refreshing to, you know, have fantasy standalones. And it's refreshing to even have these unique stories, because, you know, even the Shadows of the Dust, it's very hard to classify it. Like there's a giant turtle, and I do love, you know, the cover of it as well. I apologize, I should have pulled it up, but it's here somewhere. But the cover by Felix Ortiz is brilliant. Even with the Book of Zog, the cover, I think it's like it's from a illustration or something like that. I forget. I looked up the artist as well. It has a little bit of a thriller element or a horrific element to it, but it's not horror. But it's still striking. Like it captures your eye. So thank you so much for doing that. You know, I would really love, maybe if, you know, inspiration strikes and maybe you can have a 3rd story. Maybe it will be that eponymous Weaver in the Darkness, and we'll finally get to see the horror that it, you know, it creates in people who shudder at its name as well. Coming back to the Book of Zog, you know, you have these elements of it. You know, it begins out as a cozy fantasy, and then it kind of goes in like the epic, not epic vein, but like in like a epic medievalistic vein, and then you know, suddenly kind of like towards the half of the book you have science fantasy aspect of it, and there's even like a high fantasy aspect of it. This just made the story even harder to predict or more unique for me. How did you tie all these threads together? Like, was it just your imagination kicking in as you're writing through and these things came together?
Yeah, the way that I write is I think it was George R. R. Martin who defined things as you're an architect or a gardener. Sanderson is an architect, he's a gardener. I'm much more in the gardener side of things. So I oftentimes have an idea and I have a sense of where I want it to go, and then I just sort of write into the darkness and see what comes out. And you're right, you actually very clearly caught that tonal shift where it became more of like almost like a quest fantasy as opposed to a cozy fantasy. And a lot of people on Royal Road actually noticed that as well, because it is like a tonal shift. And that may be just my limitations as a writer, is I didn't know how I could make a satisfying story, keeping it in the direction of that cozy fantasy was going. You know, like I needed some goal and some threat to sort of create tension in the book. And a better writer may have figured out a different way to do that would still be satisfying. But for me, that was just what came to me, and I went with it.
Oh, well, it kicked the story into high gear. Like you could not, at first I could not predict where the story was going, but that just made the story even more unpredictable. And, you know, of course, like the threat which you mentioned, that is a huge threat, so as to speak, in the book. And then the found family aspect really gels together, or at least it's fun to read in, you know, what happens next. So that was really exciting to see. For our viewers, this is the book or the cover to Shadows of the Dust, which is by Felix Ortiz, and I believe the typography is by Sean T. King. Yep. Awesome guys, these. Coming back to the Book of Zog, and of course, all of these elements which you're kind of writing, the story ends on a standalone note, but there's like a very tiny teaser. You've done this both in Shadows of the Dust and you've done it in the Book of the Zog. Does that mean that you're just leaving a thread open that maybe you can come back in the day or maybe sometime in the future, or is it just for your fun purposes? Like you don't want to keep the book or the book, have it like completely closed?
I think that I find endings most satisfying when there's a bit of ambiguity to them, or there's some. In the case of the Book of Zog, there's like a very minor twist at the very end that I just wanted to hopefully leave the reader on a good note, having read it. But yeah, I do like making things not entirely pat, so that there's readers feel like there's more to the story, and I may come back to it. I might not actually. It just depends on my as I writing projects come and go. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so that's just my style of ending, I would say.
It's a very good style because you leave the story while it's the main plot of the story kind of ends in this book, but there's like that small thread. It's very enticing because you then kind of it's like, oh wait, what just happened? And it's like a very nice way to end the book because especially for a reader like me, I am always wanting more in a book, like in the world, if the book is really exciting. So for me, it's like, oh, does that mean there's going to be a future book? So kudos for doing that. I know you didn't truly intend it to be that way, but it is. Have you got any reader feedback about how you ended this book?
The most people, if I was to look at the last chapter, they like how the overall story ended up. Mm-hmm. The final twist at the very, very end, which is obviously not that integral to the main story. Mm-hmm. A lot of readers, these are Royal Road readers, so they were like, oh my god. It's like, I knew it. So I've seen their reaction. I actually have sort of made a rule that I'm not going to read reviews of my stuff that appears on like Amazon elsewhere. Mm-hmm. So I have no idea if people are trashing the book or not, because I haven't looked at the reviews once, just for my own mental health as I try to write new stuff. Mm-hmm. But the Royal Road stuff you couldn't not avoid it because they commented real time with your writing. Mm-hmm. And they tended to be very positive anyway. So, it was a good experience writing there. Mm-hmm. But yeah, their reaction was there's like a excited teenager, adolescent type reaction, which is fun to read as a writer.
Well, I can only tell you, like from the reviews that I saw on Amazon, for Book of the Zog, they're mostly, or I wouldn't say mostly, they're at least all that I read, they're very positive. Or at least all of them have been like gushing about like how this is exciting. One person even mentioned about Shadows of the Dust, like that I'm assuming it's a he, but maybe it might be they, that they are very excited about this new direction you're taking. That space fantasy, science fantasy aspects of it. So they really love that. So again, maybe you have got another fan for a trilogy.
I may work up the courage then, but yes. if a terrible one comes up front and center here, it's gonna crush me.
No, it's not. I mean, ratings wise, the reviews which I saw, they're all 4-star and above. Like there's no bad reviews, so to speak.
Okay.
But the ratings are all varied. But of course, that's with such a different book, it's going to happen. Like I feel like Amazon purposefully allows these weird reviews just to troll authors. Because I can never understand why they allow these weird reviews, but there's always this. And I have a weird review question for you as well. It's like the funniest thing I've seen on Amazon, but we'll talk about that just a little bit later.
Okay.
You happen to mention that you're currently writing something. What book can you reveal, or would you prefer not to?
I'm just a sequel to the Umbral Storm is what I'm working on now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, well, as a huge fan of the Umbral Storm, would it be okay if we spoke about that?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
How is the sequel going? Where are you at in terms of writing the overall story?
Oh, I'm not that advanced. I should be much farther along. After I publish a book, I tend to go for a couple weeks where I just need to like decompress. And then things have been very kind of unsteady here in Shanghai, so I just haven't been in the right headspace. So I'm plugging away, but I should be very advanced, and I'm not as advanced as I should be. But on the other hand, I've been thinking a lot about the story, and I know what I'm doing with it. And I like some of the ideas that have been coming to me as I've been sort of letting things gestate as opposed to just, jumping in. So maybe in the long run, it will benefit the story to have more contemplation about, the intricacies, but we'll see. Yeah. So not that advanced, but the story itself is fleshing itself out in my head really well.
Hey, you are still going to be faster than George R. R. Martin, Pat Rothfuss, and Scott Lynch. So kudos. You should never feel bad about that. Those massively talented authors are so behind. Like, anytime you're just thinking about the story, you're still doing better than them. At least for us fans, you're spoiling us because you're giving us at least a book per year. That is amazing. If you're giving us 2 books, that is, for me, that's like heaven. So please do not feel bad about that. I do want to talk about the Umbral Storm because, I know when we spoke about it last time, you had mentioned this was kind of like it was a different thing for you. It's, you previously have written epic fantasy. You have written even like sword and sorcery, but you have focused mainly on the epic side of things. This was kind of like a unique mixture of epic and progression fantasy, as you had mentioned in your interview last year. Looking back at it right now, how did the process go? Was it easy? Was it tougher?
I think I find it a little tougher than when the epic fantasy that I write, because with epic fantasy, you have more leeway to in your world, I think. Well, if you're actually trying to do something that's progression fantasy, you need to have a system, and you need to remember all the little details about that system. So as I got back into writing Umbral Storm 2, I had to reread Umbral Storm 1, and I kept a page of like careful notes about, how long it took to do this, and what I have a chart with everyone's powers listed out, and how many blank spaces they have that they should have given their amount of shards, so that I don't give them too many powers or under. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's just a lot of moving parts with a progression fantasy that that you have to be careful about. Whereas epic fantasy is a little bit more ethereal. You can sort of just, you don't need to define things as well. So it is more of a challenge. And it's a bit of a new experience for me, but yeah, I'm enjoying it.
You mentioned that, the Book of Zog began with an idea, like, Lovecraftian cozy fantasy. How did the Umbral Storm begin? What was the case, the inception for it? Like, was it the characters, the world, which is possibly the best part about this entire book, or was it something else?
I don't remember where it actually first formed. I do remember that I was having the idea actually out at a writer's retreat at Michael J. Sullivan's house with a lot of my good writing buddies, like Phil Tucker and Bryce O'Connor. We were all together, and we were talking about progression fantasy, I think, and I had the idea of, I think the initial idea was more like Highlander-esque, where everyone had a piece of some power inside them, and you could claim that power by defeating them, and you ascended in power tiers, and so that idea started to gestate a couple of years ago, I think, at that writing retreat, and it changed significantly since then. But initially, I was thinking of it like a progression fantasy in the spirit of Highlander.
Hey, it's I can see the connection between that, like what you're getting at, but it's totally different than Highlander. For people who maybe don't want it spoiled, or thinking that, oh, did he write a pastiche of Highlander? No, he did not. Alec Hutson did not write a pastiche of Highlander. There are some similarities between that, but it's totally different.
Yeah, that was just sort of the jumping off point, and then it sort of developed from there.
Going back to, the title Umbral Storm, it has a Latin root, of course, which means shadow, if I'm not wrong, umbra or umber. This book heavily features the shadow sharded. It's not a big spoiler, it's a mild spoiler, but yes, this book features or focuses on the shadow sharded people aspect in this world. Maybe will this mean that you're going to be shifting the titles, and the shard titles will be giving you a clue as to what shards are you going to focus on?
Yeah, exactly. So I've already started thinking about how I'm going to. The next title will also, the first book, I'm sure you know that in the background, which the main characters they're not fully part of like the meta plot that's unfolding behind them. You're just going to get glimpses of it, or at least that was my intent. But it's about the relationship between the shadow sharded and the storm sharded. So that's why the title was the Umbral Storm. And so the next book, as they're going to spend some time in Ashasai with the blood sharded, and some other places as well. So I'm thinking of some, the sanguine something.
Yes.
I don't know, something along those lines. I just see.
Hey, if you're gonna make me read up on Latin, this is there's no better way to do that. So that's kudos to you on that, because that's very I remember like in the book there's no word Umbral Storm ever mentioned, but there's an Umbral sword or something like that. There is a mention of like a shadow sword. So I was like, then I actually had to look up the word Umbral, like what did it mean? That's when I found out, oh, this makes sense. I'm like, that being an intelligent person that you are, that would make so much sense.
Yeah, actually, the Duskhold, which was the home of the Shadow Sharded, I initially called the Umbra, and then changed it to Duskhold during edits, because I'd actually used that word before to describe something else in another book, in another world. So, but it was sort of a placeholder initially. But yeah, so maybe that's where the title sort of developed from.
Well, whenever you happen to get an idea for fix a title for book 2 and book 3, it'll be fascinating to see what all things and how you focus on. You mentioned this really curious thing, like that there's something else going on in the world. Like in the story, it doesn't really focus on that. You get snippets of it, and you're right. You're absolutely getting snippets of it. From the Sharded's perspective, this whole school system, and then towards the latter 1/3 of where everything leading up to the climax, there's something else or something more going on. Do you plan to reveal that slowly,
Yes.
going along, or how will that work?
That's going to be a big. One of my fears about the book is that it doesn't really focus on what I see as the underlying conflict what the underlying conflict in the series will be. It kind of introduces it obliquely a little bit, and then that incident at the end, the conclusion, sort of starts to bring things together. But a lot of readers, when they finish it, still probably have no idea what the fundamental conflict is going to be about. A lot of the book is set up with world building and with the system and the characters being introduced, but not the real conflict in the world. And so that's going to become front and center for the remaining books. But yeah.
Oh wow. Okay. I was thinking like that was the epic part of the story, because this story in the Umbral Storm mostly focuses on the progressive portion of it, because you're seeing the progression of the characters' lives, you're seeing the progression of the characters' powers, and there are hints, and that is something which I loved about the story, the epic feel that you got introduced in it. Like there are these giant monsters, there's these different shard powers which people can get, depending on what shard they are able to assimilate within their body. And there is 1,000-year-plus old history. It was so fascinating. It blew my mind at least away. Would you say that this is kind of like a superpower, like building these complex, believable, and utterly fascinating worlds?
Well, that's very high praise. It's not a superpower. It's just it's just what I will say it's probably one of my strengths as a writer, and it's what I enjoyed reading as a kid. I would buy things like the Forgotten Realms. Even though I didn't play Dungeons and Dragons, I'd buy the lore books to the Forgotten Realms and just read up about the world because I found that fascinating. And so I guess when I started to write myself, I wanted the worlds to feel create a sense of wonder in the reader, and have all these intricacies that they can enjoy, because that's what I enjoyed. So I think certain readers probably do, like you, perhaps enjoy that aspect of my books, which is, I'm very grateful if there are people out there like me.
Oh, I love them. Like even in the Raveling world, like that's one of the first things that you have a map in front of, that's one of the things that I miss. There is a map, but it's not quite complete. But in the Raveling world trilogy, the map was something that I focused on a lot, and I just loved it because you had these different characters. Yes, some of them were like pseudo-European, some of them were pseudo-East Asian, and it was mind-blowingly fascinating to me. And in this one, it just went beyond that, because we have no idea of where or what corresponding part of the world Darren and Het begin with, and from where they go, and then all the other sharded warriors that they meet. Like there's the wind sharded warriors, which kind of seem like a Native American-esque, so as to speak. Again, I'm just going off from what I remember. Then the flame sharded, or no, wait, there's a storm sharded. They seem more of the naval kind, and it's so that's why I'm very fascinated to see what you come up with later on, just to see more and more of those. So
yeah, well, they're going to wander around the world. That was one of my fears with the book, is that it spends the vast majority of the time is spent, I think, in the Dust Cold, outside of
Mm-hmm.
their little trip from where the story begins. But so I'm excited about venturing off into interesting other locations and exploring the world a little bit.
Kudos, world building. As a world building junkie, I just love that. So I want to see where you where you happen to go in next. Shifting to the characters, because besides the world building, you had really three fascinating characters: Alia, Darren, and Het. Even though this was kind of like a half and half epic fantasy, you only focus it from three POV characters. Was that a conscious choice?
Yeah. I guess it's sort of like Eye of the World, Robert Jordan's books.
Mm-hmm.
All these characters, they are relatively young. They're all begin in the same place, and then you get the story from their perspectives as they venture out together. But yeah, I wanted to keep it sort of grounded with those three sort of not naive characters, but I didn't have a. I felt like introducing a character that was older and more knowledgeable would kind of undercut the magic of them experiencing the world for the first time. I don't know. That was just my thought. But yeah, actually, initially, Alia wasn't meant to be a viewpoint character. It was going to be Hef and Darren's story, but she's worked her way into the conversation now.
Well, I loved Alia's character, even though she had the least amount of POV chapters. She was, for me at least, she was most interesting. Yes, Darren and Het kind of drive the action, but I love the fact that, and this is something maybe you can tell me about as well. Like, there's not really a lot of pacifist characters we see in epic fantasy. There's almost always, you have these characters who might have these pacifist like leanings, but they of course like usually end up being, they take up the scholarly route or the sword route, or they become something like that. Alia is a truly a pacifist character. She begins out as a pacifist character. She ends up as a pacifist character, even at the stake of her own life. Can you maybe talk a little bit more about her pacifist, background, and how did you imagine her in this manner?
Yeah, well, I saw her as a very gentle soul, and you're right that epic fantasy is populated by warriors and gentle souls who become mighty warriors. But you're right, I don't really see that. She may have to. I'm sure she'll come into some conflicts in the future, but that's. Some of the critiques of the book have been that she's too passive and that everyone has to save her all the time. But I think that's my intention was not that, and I could see her saving the day through her instincts and inclinations going forward. It's just in a book with a lot of fighting in a martial culture, she's going to be at a disadvantage given her personality.
Yes, and I would say that I would take umbrage at that, that she has to be rescued. It's not that she has to be rescued. It's that, as a character, she's, always been a pacifist, and she sticks to that, which kind of places her in harmful situations, which is why the other characters then have to come to help her out. So it's not really like she's a damsel in distress. She's actually the more brilliant person between all three of them, so as to speak. So
yeah.
I don't know why the characters would feel. I mean, I kind of can see that, but I don't really think that.
Well, I would, not that I can actually argue with reviews, but for people who said that she was always getting rescued, is that she was put in that situation. She did something incredibly brave, not to spoiler, in order to be put in that situation to begin with. And she's in a situation where everyone else is basically a superhero, like superpowered, and she's not. And she's willing to risk angering them because of what she feels she has to do. So yes, she may be rescued, but a damsel in distress is the wrong definition. But anyway, it doesn't matter. Authors shouldn't be trying to argue with people's subjective interpretations of the story.
I'm sure you'll have the more you write, you'll see more and more of this. But I honestly, I would disagree with whoever that had said that, because having read this story a couple of times, I don't see that at all that way. Like you correctly mentioned, she's perhaps the bravest of them all, because she's venturing out in these tense situations without any power, so as to speak. Even the most least powered character of them all, they still have some powers or some weapons. She has nothing, and yet she's brave enough to do what she does. Going to the other two characters, you have Darren, who's kind of like the main POV character, and then you have Het. Now, both are very fascinating, and I want to focus on Darren first. Darren, and he kind of reminded me a little bit of Kaelin from the Raveling trilogy. They both have, I don't want to say they're not technically orphans, but they kind of are, because they have had a loss of a parent, which kind of has molded their psyche. And less so with Kaelin because he still had his father. Darren, unfortunately, not so much the case. Was this a coincidental move, or are these similarities just epic fantasy?
I think it's honestly just epic fantasy, that when you're writing, at least what I find when I'm writing, I like to write from the perspective of someone who is in a situation where he can experience the world for the first time, so not like the son of a powerful lord or something like that. And I think it may be subconscious, but I think it does create a sort of a link with a bond with the reader. If someone is in a bad situation to begin with, like being an orphan, they tend to think upon them favorably immediately, as opposed to someone like Hef, who I initially meant to be a redemption arc. So initially when he's introduced, I think most readers didn't like him at all. And then my goal with his character was to try and rehabilitate him over the course of the book. But you can't have a character like that in the beginning because you need readers to keep reading. So you need someone who can hopefully they can create some connection with and oftentimes personal circumstance, I think, goes into some of that.
And I still want to talk to you about a little bit more about Hef, because it was interesting to see his journey, but I'll get to that. But I want to come back to Darren for just a little bit more. So actually, I was also looking through the reviews just because I wanted to see how other people found it. I happened to, thanks to you, because of the ARC you provided, I was one of the first people, I believe, who happened to read the book. And I was so overjoyed with it. So I was always wanting to see what other people thought about it and how the reviews are coming in as well. Probably I was, besides you, or maybe even ahead of you, trawling the reviews just to see, hey, what was this point? Some people mentioned a couple of things about Darren, which I don't know. They mentioned that he seemed a little bit like a Gary Stu character. I don't quite agree with that, because like you mentioned, he's an adolescent who's experiencing these vast changes, and he's kind of trying to adapt to them as best as he can. What would you say to that? Like, is he a Gary Stu? I know it's kind of offensive to call it that, but, or just from your perspective, what do you think made those readers think of that way?
Well, the Gary Stu character idea is someone who does everything well the first time and never doesn't have any flaws and doesn't make mistakes. And I don't think that Darren is like that. I think he does have a fundamentally good character to him, which is kind of runs through a lot of my main characters, because I like writing about fundamentally good people. And he does end up having, some clearly some abilities but I think in almost all fantasy books, the main character ends up being particularly skilled at something, whether it's sword fighting or magic or whatever. So I think it would be, a lot of readers would be just as disappointed if he turned out to be not very good at whatever the fundamental, motif was of the world. So as I said, I may have told you earlier, I don't read reviews, so it's just for my own mental health. So I could definitely see that, but I don't think it's as strong as to actually label him as a Mary Sue, Gary Stu type character.
Fair enough, fair point. And of course, like you said, he feels a lot, but that's the goodness of his heart, that he still comes back thinking that okay, there's more to this. Switching to Hef, I honestly found him very fascinating. He's kind of like a lordling. This is again not a spoiler. He's a lordling. You could also characterize him as like a son of a slaver, so as to speak. Not that he believes in slavery, but his father does. And he goes through an entirely fascinating arc throughout the story. In fact, I found his arc, especially towards the end, what you did was even more fascinating, so as to speak. Did you plan him from the start, or was it just when you write? Because you mentioned that you're a gardener, so oftentimes you write and you discover things. What was his scenario like?
Oh no, actually the fundamental, like when I say I'm a gardener, I usually start with some pretty set ideas that I'm working with, and one of them was the idea of Darren and Hef. where one would be essentially a slave and one would be his master. And then I was going to flip that and see how they both reacted to that situation, and how Heth grew as a character, suddenly having his world upended and he was no longer the master, and now he was a servant or a slave. And so so that his arc was probably the thing I was most interested in writing in the book. So I don't know if I fully pulled it off, but that was the character work that I was most excited to do in this book.
Those heads. It was fun to see, as the story kept on progressing and the status kept on changing. It was fun to see from Head's perspective the tension rise in him as to what might be happening. And of course, it does happen that way. Again, I'll hold off because there's spoilers, and I don't want to spoil somebody's read for them. I apologize for asking you this. Again, it's the world building junkie in me. Do you happen to know, sir, how many books might be in the series? Because I know when we last spoke, you had mentioned that you get a better idea after, or when you plan out after book one. Anything to offer in that regards?
I've always written trilogies, and maybe it's just my fantasy background that it seems like trilogy is the way to go. But now that as I'm plotting out the second book and things are growing in the telling, I wonder whether it might be 5 books or whatever number needs to be to tell the story. We'll see. It's still a bit up in the air. I always feel like I can, if I need to, I can pull threads together quickly, but it might be fun just to let them unravel for a while longer and see where it goes.
Hey, Robert Jordan, Terry Goodkind, George R. R. Martin, excellent amount of success. I'm not comparing the quality of the writing, but I'm just saying, they let the story, they unspool the story a little bit, some more so in the case of others. But as an epic fantasy fan, I can only hope that maybe it's a 5, 6, 7 book series. Again, you would be the right person to decide when to end it as well. But I do hope that it's rather more than a trilogy, just because this world is very fascinating. And I hope that you take enough breaks in between, writing other side, maybe the third space trilogy, space fantasy story or something like that. But would love to see if this book goes on more.
Well, thank you for the support.
Oh, gladly. I do want to ask a few small, tiny spoiler questions, because again, this is not in spoilers in aspect to the characters, the story or not, but there are certain things mentioned in the story. I wanted to ask you, because a lot of characters keep on mentioning this entity. So who or what is the broken god?
Oh yeah, that's a
big one.
It's a big one. That's sort of the origin of the shards and the way the world is, and it's connected to the Radiant Emperor in the rifts and all that stuff. I do know that I gave very, very few answers in the first book, so I only alluded to things. I can assure you that there are answers and that I will pull it all together. And I think I might actually give a lot of explanation fairly early on, just to provide a bit more direction in the book. But yes, that's like at the heart of the story. So
awesome. So as you saw, I went for the big one, so that's perfectly fine. I'll wait for you to reveal it.
I want to tell you all about it. I'm just afraid that it will spoil things too much.
Perfectly fine. I am happy for spoilers, but I also understand you want me to explain the story as you imagined it. I'm happy to do so. Another small character or someone comes into the picture. They're not really referred to by their name, but they're referred to as the Elohim. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Is that?
Yeah, that's how I would pronounce it. Yeah.
Is that a big entity? Is that a big secret as well, or am I just?
It's connected to the main plot. What she is, but you at this point where you've read up to, you should have no idea. It's just sort of a mysterious figure, but there is a larger connection between her and the broken god, actually, in the general mythology of the world. But that will all be revealed, especially as they get to where they're going at the beginning of the second book. Some more, they'll encounter another character like her who has something to tell them.
Awesome. See, as this is what I love watching books. Like the world genuinely feels alive. Like there's secrets, there's aspects, and it's like it's there, but it's there to be explored. If I may ask this, your world, different nations and there are different aspects or like scenarios of the nation, but there's not. This world doesn't have quite a religiosity, so as to speak. There's not many religions. They kind of revere the sharded people. They revere them as, almost like to a godly or noble level, rightfully so, because they are superhuman, so as to speak. But was that by choice that this world does not have any major religion, so as to speak?
Yes, and that's
Okay.
part, again, related to the general mythology. But yeah, you're picking up on stuff. That's good, though. You're a very careful reader.
Well, no, I seem to be striking out, so I'm going for the bigger one. So I'll shut up after so far now. But I don't want to, I wanted this to be interesting for the reader. So if more people are seeing this, and they'll get excited about the book, and hopefully they'll jump in. Lastly, before we kind of wrap this up, Alec, was there anything in the book that which you had put in just for fun and nobody has picked up on that? Is there something like that so far?
Oh, almost certainly, but I'd have to actually think about it. But yeah, I do like to put little Easter eggs and maybe call back to other things I've written. So almost certainly,
Okay.
But I need to think about it.
Well, that's okay. I'll try to reread it maybe just for fun and during the year, and that'll be another email to you of like, hey, what did this mean? I want to wrap this up, Alec. I just wanted to say thank you again. And before we let you go, I want to ask you a few fun questions so that way it doesn't become too serious. Last time when I met with you, you had mentioned an excellent book to me that you had read, which was Hands of the Emperor by Victoria Goddard. I did read it. I found it fascinating. It's very differently written. It's epic fantasy, but it's a very different epic fantasy. I've kind of gotten into Victoria Goddard. I've downloaded a few of other books as well. So I'm actually slowly going through it, besides SPFBO, which kind of keeps me busy. But is there any other book that you have read recently in the last few months that, managed to capture your fancy? Or would you like to give a shout out to anybody else?
Oh, I need to look at my.
Sure.
May I leave just for 1 second and grab my iPad? Because
please do. And so for the viewers who are watching, this is the most recent book which he had released.
Okay, so I'm just going to look really quick at what I've been reading. Oh, I reread Fever Dream lately, which is really, really good.
George R. R. Martin.
Yeah. I've read it when I was very much younger, and I'd forgotten how good it was. It really is a fantastic vampire story for anyone who is into vampire stories. Very different. His strength as a writer that you see in Game of Thrones. He's a fantastic short story writer and a fantastic writer of other novels.
Yep.
In terms of other stuff, I've been reading. I read like Nona the Ninth recently, and She Who Became the Sun, and the last sort of indie book that I finished recently was Light Blade, which was quite good. It was really good. Really enjoyed it. Yeah, really, really, really interesting book. It's one of those books you could not predict the direction it was going. It's got a fascinating world. Really fun read. I really liked it. That was the most recent indie book I think I've read that I could recommend highly to those who like fantasy and epic fantasy and progression fantasy.
Zamil Akhtar is a fascinating guy. I read his previous book, Gunmetal Gods. It's quite a departure. Like Gunmetal Gods is like epic grimdark of featuring like it's kind of like a crusade-like scenario, but of course there's a lot more going on. And he goes to some really wild angles towards the end of the book. Like, he kudos to him. And he managed to release it in 2020 of all, it was just coincidental, but still it was. And then he wrote this book, which is, I think, focusing on Indo-Persian mythology. I've read only a little bit. I haven't finished it, but he has been doing some really fascinating stuff. So I'm hopeful that, I'm glad you pointed it out. So I'll try to put in a link to that as well. Well, Alec, thank you so much for your time as always, and thank you for sharing all these insights into both the Book of Zog and to the Umbral Storm. I want to wish you all the best for writing the sequel, because I am a greedy bastard and I would like to read this, so that's why. But for our viewers, is there any? Do you like to offer any parting words, sir?
Just that I really appreciate this opportunity, Mihir. It's always great to talk to you. It's really fun to hear someone be excited about my work, and gives me that inspiration to go out and bang out some words because I want to satisfy people like you. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you as always. For everybody else, thank you for joining us. Please do check out Alec's books. You can check out the Umbral Storm review as well as the Book of Zog review, and go ahead and buy them because believe me, your mind is going to be blown. So thank you, everyone. Have a good, wonderful rest of your day. Bye.